So let me ask you, I'm just curious, your reactions to either those 9, what I'm trying to do is give you different schema, different series of questions. Thematically, they're all linked, but whether you're thinking about the 9 things, the 9 questions, or these 28 or 26 questions, depending on the age of the child, the whole point is to give you different ways of interacting with kids, to think about where you can intervene to make them more resilient, more robust. And notice I'm phrasing this. I'm not saying about the kid being resilient. I'm saying, what can we do to make the child more resilient? So let me ask you about any reactions to those 28 or 26 questions that you just experienced. I'm just curious about people's, oh, and by the way, I should also preface, yes, you can get this measure for free. We give it away. It's well validated now. We have lots of data from around the world. It's being used with all kinds of different communities. Aboriginal here in Australia, it's being well tested, I think, throughout Australia with all kinds of different populations as well. And all you have to do is write us at rrc@dal.ca, or there's also a link on our website for the toolkit, what's called a toolkit that we have. But if you can't find that, just write us, and you'll get a link, and it takes about 30 seconds to get permission to use it. It's a very, very small thing that we do to just ask who you are, and away we go. And yes? If I give you this microphone.
Just to make the link, we've actually embedded this within the students. Yeah, just make the link, we've embedded this measure within the students who are TSS.
I was aware of that. That's great. So the TSS is actually using it as well. It's right embedded into the intake or the questionnaires. Thanks. I'm curious about your reactions to any of those questions, or if you have any questions about why those questions are in there. Any catch your attention, or any questions that you couldn't answer? Great, just back here. Any questions that you couldn't answer, that kind of thing. I'm just curious. What's your reaction?
I just wonder.
I know it's me, eh?
The difference in responses you have from a student entering a situation where they're not under stress and answering questions on this versus ones that are in the midst of crises.
Absolutely. That's exactly the point. Is that that you'd expect the answers to change, of course, right? More likely they'd be lower if a child was out of community, out of place. So for me, I would be looking at those differences and say, okay, well, you're scoring low on number 23 or 21 or whatever. How can I help you to increase that particular score? Now, you don't have to score high on all 28. This isn't some like magic formula, right? This isn't like, oh, I'm now magically resilient. I mean, there is cutoff scores on this. We figure out of 140, somewhere around about 117. Generally speaking, your odds are that the child's a teenager is going to do better, somewhere around that sort of 117, 116 range, depending on the population. But that's a pretty much of a guess in general. So yeah.
So sorry, it's a two-part question, I guess. And this is something that we've noticed at our school. The transition as a service provider does very well, as they're very proactive.
Wow.
And before the crisis hits, they're actually involved with the students in mentoring.
That's great.
But you're saying it seems like we'd use this as a diagnostic in the proactive stage and the reactive stage, and just try to identify those situations so we can wrap services around them.
That's the way it's being used as a way of assessing prior to a problem. Almost like an intake. You could use it and say, I'm curious, what's going on in your life, and especially if you have a child that's just moved communities. My guess is a lot of their scores would go down. Because they've come out of a place where they may have had a lot of these resources, because resilience is about resources. Now they're in a situation where they don't have those resources. So is that why they're, turning to problematic behaviors, or is that why they're wanting to leave this situation and go back to a place where they feel like they have more of those resources? That's sort of the reasoning behind it. Please.
Just appreciate it. Hi, Paul. Just appreciate a comment. We've tried self-assessment type tools like this on 2 occasions a while ago. And what we found we trialled them for some time. What we found is that youth scores universally went down over the course of programming. So pre-program, they would say, I get along great with people, I cooperate well with people. After the program, they'd actually have some sense of reality about that, and their scores would be lower post-program. But that wasn't what the tools were designed that the design of the tools would indicate that you should have some improvement over programs, but what we consistently had was lower scores.
That's interesting. Let me comment on that from two ways. First of all, as a tool, we generally don't, I'm not sure how you're doing this, Janya, but we don't normally, a lot of places where we work, we read out the measure. We don't assume that a child will, here it is, fill it in. In fact, that rarely is how we do it because we assume zero literacy when we work with kids. And we also encourage code switching in the languaging of this. Unlike more strict psychological measures, CBCL and other, where you have to read the question exactly, we prefer that it be read in a way that's contextually relevant. So if you need to switch a word like, what's the question on spirituality? Kids, what's spirituality? Well, does your life do you feel like your life has a meaning, like a bigger purpose? We would do that, and that's perfectly fine. Plus, we're reading it out to the kids, so there's engagement a little bit there. But you're right. Actually, this is common. I don't know if you know this, but this is a very common thing that happens. Is you have a false positive almost on the front end, right? You have an elevation. People tend to answer these kinds of questionnaires very positively at first, and then at the time two, their scores go down, and it looks like the program has failed. And it's not that at all. It's actually that the kid trusts you and has more self-consciousness, and their score is more accurate at time two. The real way to do assessments on programs is, of course, you need a time three. And it's at time three that you normally see the increase. That's where you see the impact of the program. So you usually have time one, time two. Time two is very often lower. It looks like you're all failing, but it's not. It's actually more engagement. The child's more ready to answer, and then you see the bump in time three. Very common pattern in our data as well. It pisses the funders off. We just put $100,000 into that, and you're telling me the kids are getting worse? No, this is good news. They're all getting worse. This is good. They're being honest. So it's a little bit, and there's all kinds of other, I won't get into all the psychometrics of this, but why the questions are all positively worded. There's a reason for that. We're not naive to the fact that there's bias and the response bias because of it. If you want to have a discussion over lunch about the design of measures and stuff, I'd be happy to engage with anyone and have debates on that. Actually, I really wouldn't be happy to do that, actually, to tell you the truth, but if you really want to do it, bring over a coffee, a strong coffee, and we'll do that. Other questions or comments? It's a really great. Were any of the questions surprising to you? Did any of them that you didn't routinely know about the children that you were working with?
I'm not surprised by it, but I just want to get your comments on it as well about the one about do I participate in organised religious activities?
Yeah, it's a fascinating why it's there. Okay, so again, we started with 258 questions from around the world. Through a series of psychometric testing, we kept screening out the questions that disappeared, that stopped performing. We came up, we kept trying to get rid of that darn question. And the data kept telling, no, you have to keep answering this question, because when you're talking about marginalized communities, generally speaking, the rates of participation in organized religious activities is higher. Let me give you a simple example. If you go to Israel, the rates of participation in synagogue is actually quite low. People in Israel, just because they're a Jewish state, doesn't mean that they actually believe in God or go to religious ceremonies or anything like that. That's a bit of a myth in some ways. There's a lot of religious people, mind you. But actually, if you look in the diaspora, when Jews are in the diaspora, they tend to go to synagogue much more. Why? Why? Because they're more religious than people back in Israel? No. Because you're in the diaspora. You're outside of your home community. You're being oppressed. You turn to communities. You find through religious organizations support. In Canada, I live in a community which has we have a group of African Nova Scotians, people who are racially black, I guess, a lot of different terms. African Nova Scotian is now the term that we would go by. But their rates of participation in church, in Christian-based organizations, is much, much higher than the general population. Why? They're not any more God-fearing or believing or anything. I think it's honestly because they find that there's a safety in the community. It's a space where they meet. Now, maybe I'm not, whatever your religious, I don't want to get into a religious debate here, but it's fundamentally about what that association does. And what we find is consistently around the world, as you see communities under stress, religious participation seems to go up. And that's just an anomaly in that. And this is a measure for people under stress. Remember, I didn't say strengths. This is not a strengths measure. These things are good for my kids too. I have in a blended family situation, I have 5 children. But I got to tell you, these are strengths. Yes, my kids could score in this, but frankly, it's not really a measure of their capacities. These are good things for kids when they're under stress. That's how it goes. So thanks you for raising that. It's the question that usually stumbles on.
Just further on to that, because we're a Catholic boarding school.
Oh, are you?
Participate in religious activity, but voluntarily, another question.
Thank you for that. That would be a very good question. That's right. It doesn't say that, does it? Yeah. And again, we're kind of getting at that. That's right. It's I think it was, when the question was developed, it meant in the sense of some personal efficacy to decide if you want to be part of that. Though in a family, it's a bit hard because you're talking about kids at home and families. If your parents tell you have to go to church on Sunday or you have to go to mosque on Friday, you tend to do it because your parents insist, have expectations on you. But sometimes that's okay for the kids because there's an expectation, it creates structure, and then they connect to a community and their culture. So it's like a domino effect again, right? So it's a little coercive, but it actually has benefits up to a point. Then the child turns 15 and they say, I'm not going there anymore. You say, okay, that's your own business. Please.
Hi.
It
is good.
When
first looking at this survey, it is very positive, but for our kids, I think this would be the first time that they've seen a survey like this and filled out. So I'm not sure this is a question, but a comment. I guess maybe how do you take that into account? But secondly, the point when the survey is taken,
yes.
Is there a time when you shouldn't survey or should survey? So if the child was feeling exceptionally angry or negative or something traumatic has just happened in their lives.
Sure.
And third, as Aboriginal people, we tend to answer things very positively anyway.
Right. Yep.
And do you account for that bias as well?
So all those questions are great. We do find that people, if you read these questions out to kids, they're really meant to be conversational, right? Like you might. I'm not promoting quantitative measures as okay, now you have to do this. Right? This is not the point of this. The point of this is some extra questions for you to ask. And so if you're having conversations with the kids as you're getting to know them, I would encourage you to, over time, get through most of those 28 questions. To ask these kinds of questions. So it's more conversational. If you want the child to actually answer all 28 because you're trying to keep some sort of records, sure, over time you could ask them each of the 28 questions. Yes, I would never do anything with a child who's in crisis at the moment. I would accept to support them and sit there with them. There's obviously timing is extremely important. But we have found that kids we're doing this measure right now. We're in the most rural part of Sierra Leone. In fact, here's how funny this got. The ethics committee at our university insisted that there's standard protocols when you do measures like this, when you're doing research, you have to actually give a kid the copy of their consent form. You know how people are asked to sign consent forms? We are so far off the grid that there's no electricity usually. If there is electricity, the nearest photocopy machine is 6 hours drive through mud. Okay? Then they wanted us to give the child a piece of paper that would be the consent form. So think about it. The only children in this entire village that have a piece of paper in their house would now be the ones who participate in the study. So how would you identify the child who participated in the study? Because they have a piece of paper in their house. That's what our ethics boards in North America thought that we should do. So we told them to basically fuck off. And you know, and we said, that's stupid. A bunch of corporate lawyers who are sitting around this office here and are, you know, well, whatever. We're going to educate you now a little bit on what the realities are. And we convinced them to be a little more sane. Sorry, that's a little, you know, you get a stupidity. You have to actually deal with these people, these kinds of people who are so myopic and ethnocentric and everything else. Anyways, all to say is so the point of this is you want to do this in as culturally relevant a way as possible. And you want to be sensitive to people's timing, and of course, but you can do this in really people who haven't never done this kind of stuff. You can, if you put in somebody who's culturally relevant from the community. We always hire locally. We try to do that. And you sit them down. You're going to have a conversation, and we're going to show you what this is. It's amazing the response. By the way, the other thing we found, to be truthful, we found technology really great. If you have an electricity source where you're going, and you can use an iPad. I don't know why, but kids all over the world seem to be getting iPads. I don't know. Like, I don't care how remote you go. We've gone pretty remote. iPads seem to be working if you have an electricity source. So there's something about, you know, hitting the screen. I don't know why, but that technology stuff is really interesting. Even in your remotest communities, do kids have cell phone access? Is that permeated? Sometimes, yeah. A lot of the communities, even in where I just described in rural Sierra Leone, I'll tell you this, they may only have power 2 hours a day or 1 hour a day. All the kids have cell phones. It's the most amazing thing, what's called leap technology. Kids are using cell phones at a huge high rate of saturation into the community. So all health-related stuff is now going through cell phone technology. Very, very basic cell phone technology is being used as a way of engaging young people. It's neat, just to sort of think outside the box before we assume that kids don't. So they will participate, but it has to be done very, very culturally sensitive. That's what I'm trying to emphasize.
Just on that note, some of the aid agencies around getting information out via cell phones actually have solar panel lamps.
Oh, so some of the aid organizations are getting out through cell phones with solar-powered lamps?
Lamps that have USB ports to charge devices.
Yes. Yeah, have you seen those USB charger that you can, even there's one that you light a little fire in, eh? Have you seen this? The technology now exists to light you have a little camping stove, you put in twigs and stuff, you light a fire, and it charges your cell phone. It's pretty cool. It's really expensive. I don't think it's permeated the communities, but the technology is existing. One last, before I move on, what I'm trying to do is give you lots of things that you can ask kids. Lots of ways to engage with them. And my argument is the more of these things you give kids, the more likely they are to withstand stressors. That's really what the principle is. Concrete enough? Kind of get it? Yep.
So Michael, you're not necessarily suggesting that this is an instrument. But is it possible that, for example, a school might map 20 of the questions across 5 different units of work in a year and be able to arrive at an informed, co-created response to that question in the context of a unit in school?
That was kind of vague. I'm sorry. What do you mean by a unit in school?
So a curriculum unit. So for example, if we want to know whether I have a young person coming from, say, a remote community on Cape York actually has people that they look up to and that they can cooperate with people around them and that they think getting an education is important to them.
Sure.
Blah, blah, blah. So there might be a subset of these questions
Sure, if you want to.
that are answerable in a unit of work.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Sure.
That is the orientation unit for getting to know you as a class and individuals in my class.
Okay.
So is that still applicable then if you've got some sort of notion for an individual around that and then maybe next term, so 10 weeks later, you find another set of questions that you could embed in a curriculum unit of work so that there's a degree of conversation and understanding and exploring and dialogue around what these things actually mean.
If you wanted to use it that way, more power to you. I mean, it's not, from a psychometrics point of view, some of the predictive, I'd be less certain if you wrote me, say you write me next year, you say, oh, it's really great, these kids are scoring like this on the, I have no idea what that means because it's hard to parse it out like that. But from a point of view of intervention, if you're telling me workers are talking to kids about these things and they're identifying strengths in the kids and things that they're trying to improve, more power to you. Just use it any which way you want, absolutely. The point is to get a conversation going, right? For instance, you know those questions towards the bottom that says, do you enjoy your cultural traditions, right? Stuff like that. Do you routinely ask kids that? When they come into your services? Do you really routinely know? Do you enjoy your communities and your family's cultural traditions? And if the kid says, I don't know, that's a conversation starter, right? If the kid says yes, that's a great conversation starter. Then you say, okay, now that you're living in a residence for kids, how are you going to continue to enjoy your family's culture traditions? Right? Isn't that the challenge? And your job then is to facilitate access to those cultural traditions. Right? Isn't that the job? And then you're saying, well, we don't have any way of doing that. And you say, well, no wonder if you can't, then your kid is basically going to drop in their resilience. The next time there's a crisis, they're not going to have a sense of community. They're not going to have a sense of identity. Somebody calls them a racial slur, racially disrespects them. They're not going to have an anchor to protect them against that racial slur. That's what we're sort of talking about.